November Tynwald was a lengthy 3-day sitting with discussions on housing, the future of our pensions and the National Insurance Fund, health and drugs policy, just some of the items squeezed into a very busy order paper. We've got a spicy seasonal winter mix of Tynwald highlights on this week's Perspective, and we'll start off with Chief Minister Alf Cannon, who is still looking after the health department in the absence of a new health minister. You had a motion in Tynwald basically to receive the, I think it was the annual report of Manx Care, and it was certainly an interesting discussion. This programme might be thinking, well, surely to goodness you do need to link your mandate to the operational plan, to the budget.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason why I sort of quite speedily brought the whole debate forward, the Manx Care annual report was due to be laid anyway, but tagged on at the end, and to note that work is ongoing to align the budget with the mandate with the operating plan, was done deliberately to allow Tynwald to have a voice around the current position, particularly with regards to this significant overspend, and to help move things forward. It's been 3 years now since Manx Care was established. We're 3 years down the line. We've had significant overspends almost every single year, and this year's been no different. But there comes a point where you've had to draw the line, and we've been through robustly through that argument. And the former health minister, has decided to walk away from his job and the challenge that was in front of him. So we've picked that up now.
But he's not walked away from the debate.
Well, he hasn't walked away from the debate. But the bigger point is we've got to use this opportunity now to resolve some of these issues for the long-term security of the island, both in terms of how healthcare is delivered, but also very, very importantly in terms of our budgets and our sustainability of our reserves, particularly because we just can't go on funding health over and above the financial framework that is being offered to it at the budget. And we've got to get that back into order. And the point about aligning this budget, which they get from the Treasury, the operating plan that Manx Care themselves design, and the mandate that the DHSC write and give to them is vital, Phil, because although there was arguments yesterday that nothing's wrong, well, my view, the view of Council of Ministers, and clearly the view of majority of Tynwald, is something is not aligned if within 2 or 3 months of approving budgets and noting mandates and noting operating plans, there's a £16 million overspend going on. So this is the critical challenge in front of us. We're working really hard to overcome this. I've had some very positive discussions with Wendy Reid and Teresa Cope. They've gone away at the moment to write their operating plan for next year. We'll evaluate that against the budget, of £357 million, which was the budget that's already been set in last year's Pink Book for next year. And we will then review the mandate in line with that, because there's areas already established where there's friction points, I think, between Manx Care, the DHSC, and of course, particularly Tynwald and the Minister. And we can do a much better job in putting this into a more aligned and healthier framework.
And of course, the former minister is very much sticking to his guns in saying that the problem is if you want to have a good quality, high-level health service on the Isle of Man, you have to fund it properly. It's fair to say that Teresa Cope, Chief Exec of Manx Care, has said very clearly in interviews I've done with her in the past that there are efficiencies to be driven out, but that takes time. Do you think this is just a timing issue, or is it that it will resolve itself in the next few years, or are you effectively, as new health minister, saying, look, we haven't got a few years, we have to resolve this next year?
No, we have to resolve this now, Phil. It's no good thinking that this is going to be resolved in a few years' time. We've invested many multi-millions of pounds into Manx Care. We've put in place a professional board, a professional executive, highly paid executive. We've grown the doctors, we've grown the numbers of nurses. but we cannot let it get out of control. It's absolutely vital that the health service evidences now, next year particularly, that it can operate within budget, given the amounts of money that it is receiving. And the critical point is, people are arguing, well, you're not getting the care that we need, but the healthcare system has to operate within the budget that we have available for it. If we need more money, then we need to discuss that sensibly and look at that objectively. What we don't need to be doing is setting budgets, having a blasé view about that, spending tens of millions of pounds in excess, and then determining without proper evidence that the system is underfunded. Because, there has to be discipline, and that discipline has to be clearly evidenced, and that evidence clearly will come about through effective governance and reporting and controls. And it's clear that those controls and governance have been lacking, and we need to put it right. That's why extra resources have now been put into the financial management, both in the short term but also with planning for next year in mind. That's why Manx Care have brought in additional support at operational level, senior operational level, to drive through the efficiencies for this year, but also help with their strategic planning for next year. And I'm hoping that by empowering Manx Care to bring forward their operating plan as the first step forward, that we will begin to understand how the budget is being allocated, where it's been allocated to, what the political priorities are for next year. For example, do we want more money into GPs? Do we want more money into dentistry? To have those discussions, to write the mandate then following that, so that we're clear about the services we're committing to, the services that we're going to invest in, and then move forward. And then I hope we will be in a far better position to stay within our budgets. And when those pressures come, and there are pressures, well, we need to first of all make sure there's resilience in the budget in terms of how that is being applied. In other words, we've got to get a very clear budgeting mechanism put in place to allow for some of these fluctuations that are naturally going to occur in a demand-led system. But we also, I think, need a system in place where we can commit some additional resources, but the governance around that needs to be firmly in place. In other words, if a part of the service is starting to overspend, I hope that we will be able to ask them to come and bid for additional funding, and then we will evaluate that bid and then give them the money if they then can evidence that it is clearly needed. So there's all sorts of improvements that can be made, but it starts now. It absolutely starts now. This is not an exercise that's going to end in a few years' time. I've made that very clear to Wendy Reid and Teresa Cope. We're all on board with that. I know that within the organisation there's a clear recognition now that this needs to change. And by the 1st of April next year, I expect to have all the pieces in place to go into next year properly funded in terms of a clear recognition of what that means for the operating plan and what that means for the mandate.
As well as the health department, you're trying to be the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man at the same time, and both are probably the biggest jobs, or certainly among the biggest jobs in Manx politics. Is this part of the reason why you haven't been able to find a replacement health minister? Because you're so busy being the health minister, you don't have time to have the conversations necessary to create the team? Or are we about to learn the name of the new health minister? Or where are we at with that whole discussion?
Well, this is the number one big priority for the Council of Ministers. We clearly have other major priorities as well in terms of our housing and security and economy, but the real pressing challenge is absolutely evident in terms of the threat that healthcare spending is providing to our fiscal security. So Council of Ministers is fully committed to this exercise, and we're putting as much effort and resources into this as we can do to get it right for the long-term security of the island. In terms of the support I'm getting, I am getting plenty of support from my fellow ministers in a number of areas. And of course, in terms of commitment from the health perspective, we have a very clear and structured and orderly set of commitments as to when I will be available to deal with health. What I will be doing, absolutely as a bare minimum, is strengthening the political team around that. You can expect some announcements in terms of how that is going to be strengthened. And I have had time to speak to everybody in Tynwald, or almost everybody, about their current positioning in terms of their contribution to government and what they would consider doing next. But look, Council of Ministers and I are not just going to let this just run away with itself in the next 3 or 4 months and appoint a minister and let everything scuttle off into a corner and not be addressed. You know, it is a priority for us. We are all engaged, and I think Tynwald is engaged, and I made that point to members of Tynwald when I was speaking yesterday. This involves all of us, each and every single one of us. It is so important. It touches every aspect of our lives, of our families' lives. So we have to get delivery of healthcare into the best possible shape that we can. And if there's an issue, and there is an absolute issue, then we all need to properly engage in delivering it. But for the Council of Ministers, that means a proper oversight, a proper understanding of what's going on. And if that means that I lead a team for the next 2 or 3 months to get this right and take that personal responsibility, given the impact that it has had and is having potentially on our long-term security of our finances, then so be it, Phil. But it will not be for the long term, but there may well be a few months where you're getting me for twice the price, if you like.
That wasn't quite what he meant to say, so here's another try.
Yes, there may be a few months where you're getting twice the money for half the price. No one is still going to get that right. Anyway, something like that.
Of course, what the Chief Minister is trying to say is we're getting 2 ministers for the price of 1, but after 3 days of Tynwald, we both agreed not to try and get it in a third take. The reason, of course, we're getting 2 ALFs for the price of 1 is because Laurie Hooper stepped down as Health Minister. Mr Hooper was very vocal on a range of matters in Tynwald, so we'll start with his housing question.
Yeah, it was interesting. We were talking about housing. Obviously, housing is a real big issue for this administration. It's been put forward as one of the priorities is to sort this problem out. I think one of the island plan aims is about creating 2,000 more homes. But it turns out the Minister for Infrastructure has now confirmed over the last 3 years there hasn't been a single additional public sector house built because there haven't been any plans come forward, nothing's been approved. You talk to local authorities and they're saying, well, actually, the DOI is holding up some of these things. And the DOI is saying, well, no, there aren't any plans coming through. But actually, to have confirmed, when I asked the Minister, does that mean you haven't built anything? And the answer was yes. Absolutely blew my mind, if I'm honest.
You've been in Council of Ministers for much of the last 3 years. Presumably there's been extensive discussion and debate about housing.
You'd think, wouldn't you? But not really. The Housing and Communities Board that I was a part of, the focus there was on dealing with policy issues like homelessness or care leavers, actually what should we be doing around those kind of provisions. But the Housing and Communities Board never had the power to go away and actually build houses. That's always sat with local authorities, the DOI, and I was always under the impression, obviously the erroneous impression, that there was house building going on because they're always talking about new housing schemes and this, that and the other. But it turns out all of that is refurbishment work or replacement. It's not actually increasing the amount of housing stock available for the public sector. And that's shocking because we have public sector housing waiting lists. We know there's a real issue with rental markets on the Isle of Man, and the Minister openly accepted when I challenged him that the only real way to resolve these problems is to build more houses, and yet it turns out that's something that the government has quite honestly not been doing.
There's a developing theme, I suppose, in as much as your comments in relation particularly to the education plan debate were a bit similar, really. You were saying there's lots of policies, lots of words, and the actions were the bits that you were looking for.
Yeah, and it's a real problem, actually. I mean, I've always been quite clear that I don't believe in producing a strategy unless you're going to fund it, unless you're actually going to go and do stuff. And that's what I've been trying to do myself over the last few years. But looking at this education plan, it's exactly the same. We're going to review this, we're going to talk about that, we're going to think about this. And you think, okay, that's the kind of language you use on day one of an administration. We're 3 years in. Now it should be about, we're going to go and do something, we're going to go and deliver on this. And we need to know what it's going to achieve. What's the outcome? Is it going to improve students' grades? Is it going to make courses more available? What is it going to do for people? Not just, oh yes, we've offered 100 things, we've done 4 things. Well, actually, what does that mean? It's meaningless, actually. And it is quite worrying to see a lot of these department plans and reports and things coming through where lots of nice sounding words, but actually when you really drill down into it, what are they actually doing that's going to make things better for people? And that's a question that the government seems really, really struggling to answer at the minute.
Similar comments, of course, were made in relation to the agriculture and food strategies, that whilst the strategies all look good, if they're not funded, it's going to be difficult to see how there's going to be a significant improvement.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. The departments that are working on the front lines of this stuff have all got great ideas, and there's lots of good stuff in there. But ultimately, a lot of it comes down to, are we actually going to fund this? And if we're not going to fund it, is there another way of doing it that doesn't require any money, or can you save the money from somewhere else? And if we're not going to find the money, why are we bothering to put out a plan that says we're going to do all these wonderful things if everyone knows hand on heart it's not going to be funded? And that's the core problem here, I think, and it's going to come up when we talk about Manx Care later on in the sitting, no doubt, that government is making all these promises and all these commitments, but actually when it comes down to the crucial question of, is that going to be funded? And the answer at the moment is, well, we just don't know, and that's a real problem.
You're the leader of the Liberal Vannon Party. What would you be doing different were the Liberal Vannon Party elected?
So I think the core thing that we've always been quite clear on as a party is we know our high service, low tax system doesn't work, and it's not sustainable in the long term. We also know that you can't keep taxing people. People are paying a lot of tax already through income tax and national insurance. They can't bear any more of that. And the economic strategy that we paid a lot of money for actually says the same thing. It says you need to broaden your tax base. You need to look at taxing things you don't currently tax. And by and large, that means things like capital or assets, things that every developed jurisdiction in the world has a tax on. And you're not talking big numbers here. I'm not standing here suggesting we need to start having a 40% inheritance tax. That would be mad. But actually, the fact that we don't tax property and we don't tax capital, we don't tax wealth is very unusual. We're a very unusual jurisdiction in that respect. And that's fine if that's the direction you want to go down, but then you have to accept you can't have all the services you want. My view is actually you want to provide those services and people expect them. What they need confidence in is that everyone is paying their fair share. And I think if you went out there and asked that question now, do the Manx public think that everyone is paying their fair share? The answer would probably be no, that working families are the ones paying, by and large, the lion's share of our taxes. We've got a tax cap, for example. Loads of things that exist that actually protect very wealthy people from paying what I would class as a fair share into the system. And I think that's the one thing that we would be doing differently as a party, is we would be talking to the Manx public quite openly about, okay, what does paying a fair share look like? What does that mean?
And of course, then that neatly brings us around to your comments on the National Insurance Fund. You made an attempt to make the debate a meaningful debate, in as much as the debate as written on the order paper was merely a general debate for general discussion of principles rather than any significant outcomes. You didn't get a huge amount of support from your colleagues, though.
No, and I wasn't expecting it, if I'm honest. What I was surprised at was the Council of Ministers refusing to support its own policy principles. That was quite a bizarre situation to be in, having the Treasury Minister say, no, I'm not going to vote to agree these policy principles. It's almost like government wants control of the policy, wants to do its own thing without Tynwald interfering, without Tynwald oversight. And that's quite concerning, because I think we know what's going to happen next. Is Treasury's going to walk away and assume that report's been received, and that's what's going to form the basis of their policy discussion going forwards. They're going to make changes. And the reality is, like we all know, a lot of stuff needs to happen on the island in order to move us forward, and a lot of it does come down to where you're going to get the money from. Right? So, building public sector houses, for example. The National Insurance Fund is invested in UK property stocks. There's a Tynwald answer published recently that openly accepts that. So it's okay to invest our National Insurance Fund in UK property, but it's not okay to invest our National Insurance Fund in Manx property.
There were some pretty sound arguments put, I thought, maybe you may have thought differently, basically suggesting that the Isle of Man, that generally as a market to invest money, is relatively small, and that if you start investing our money in our own economy and things go badly wrong, you could end up with, first of all, no significant return on your investment, as well as having an economic crisis of some kind to deal with anyway. Do you not understand or share perhaps some of those concerns?
So that concern is around the concentration of risk. So if I was suggesting that you take the whole fund and invest it all on the Isle of Man, that would be a bad idea. You want to make sure your risk is spread across different types of investments, different jurisdictions. That's definitely very sensible. But taking a small portion of the fund and investing it in something as rock solid as housing, that's slightly different, because we know that we're always going to need public sector housing. We've got demand right now. So even if the economy slows down, we need that housing today anyway. And that housing is going to generate a return. And I think that point was lost, I think, in the discussion in Tynwald, that I wasn't suggesting for a moment that we take the entire NI fund, invest it all in a very small area of concentrated risk and say that's all our eggs are in that basket. That wouldn't be a good idea. But actually saying, well, currently all of our eggs are in the UK basket in various forms. Fine, let's take one of those eggs and invest it on the island. That's what I was talking about really in terms of how the money should be invested. And that didn't really get a lot of traction with Tynwald. I was quite surprised the idea of investing in our own people, in our own island, wasn't supported more broadly, which was quite concerning, actually, because I do believe in this island and I do believe we have to invest in ourselves and believe in ourselves if we're going to grow things. But that clearly isn't the view the government has, and it clearly isn't a view shared by my colleagues in Tynwald.
So in essence, if you're right, and this is going to be seen as an opportunity by Treasury to have a report received, and well, it's received, so it's as good as accepted, that we're going to see one or other of the variants of the break in the triple lock in relation to the pensions promise. Are you happy that, or are you, well, it's not so much happy, is it? Are you content that it is necessary for that triple lock to go?
That's a really interesting one, because I think the evidence would say that the triple lock itself probably isn't sustainable in the long term, but you should be protecting the value of a pension so that it isn't eroded by inflation. Are there other ways you can do that? Probably there are, but like was pointed out in the debate, the report actually uses UK inflation figures, which is totally irrelevant for a Manx pensioner. So until we know what the effect of those changes would be using Manx rates of inflation, I don't think it's possible to say, because all the modelling has been done based on UK inflation rather than Manx inflation, which is quite concerning. The report also excludes any growth in the population, and that again is quite concerning. One of the accusations made in the debate was, what does that mean, government's abandoning its island plan targets? And the government has said no. Well, actually, hold on, if you're planning to grow the population by 15,000 working people, why are you not factoring that into your calculations? Because it could very well be that population growth means you can keep the triple lock, but we don't know the answer to that question. So Treasury feels to me they're putting the cart before the horse here in saying, well, that's the only solution. Well, of course it is, based on the data you've used there, but if you change some of those assumptions, how does that change your potential thinking around the future of the National Insurance Fund? And those are questions that I think Treasury aren't able to answer right now.
But Treasury does have to be prudent in its assumptions, doesn't it? I mean, it has to assume the least positive outcome, I suppose, and then anything more than that is seen as a benefit. So, for example, Treasury can't assume that the economy is going to pick up eventually, and obviously if the economy did pick up, then the National Insurance Fund would grow, and some of these issues would become a more distant concern than they are at the moment. Yeah,
absolutely. But I think there's a difference between being prudent and ignoring all your government plans. And it feels like at the moment they're ignoring them rather than just taking a prudent approach. The other thing I was quite surprised about is another part of my amendment said they should protect the value of the fund. The report talked a lot about needing at least 2 years in the fund, and that makes sense. 2 years of your expenditure in a fund, that's relatively standard. And actually, the government voted against that as well. They don't want to protect the core value of the National Insurance Fund, and that again is quite concerning, because if they're not going to stand up and say, yes, we should protect the value of this fund, what are their plans for the fund then?
Ramsey MHK Laurie Hooper. Speaker of the House of Keys, Ewan Watterson, SHK, was quite vocal in the national insurance and pensions debate.
I go back to when I was member for Social Security in 2007, and that really was the old days, but when the UK were introducing the pension reforms then, and that had really serious knock-on impacts to us. And at that time, it was very much felt that we had to follow the UK, and we've since ploughed our own furrow a bit more since then. Some of those fundamental issues that were created by those UK issues, like having fewer contributing years for a full pension, lowering the amount of minimum years that you needed in order to be able to start accruing a pension, these sorts of things, those are still with us, and perhaps undoing some of those would be the way forward in the longer term. That's definitely something I think, as we are having more autonomy over our own pension arrangements, that something that could be done, and making a bit more of that transient population that comes to the island for just a few years and then move away again, rather than building up pensions. They never used to be able to do that, but they are now. Certainly, we shouldn't be just handing the money back, which is the government's present policy, that the NI rebate scheme, come here, work for your first year, get all that NI back, and that's a cracker's move. If you've got the issue being, we don't have a sustainable NI fund, well, maybe stop giving the money back then would be a good first start, and stop taking the money out, the interest return on the capital, because again, that's not going to help either.
You did mention perhaps a 5-year de minimis period, during which time effectively people new to the Isle of Man would not actually get any benefits from the National Insurance Fund.
Well, we already have similar things for Social Security, and we used to have a similar arrangement before the 2007 pension reforms. You had to have done 10 qualifying years before you actually were able to even get a state pension in the first place. So whether those years should be Manx years, should be UK years, or a mixture of the two, is something that should be open for debate. And we should be able to look again at that Social Security reciprocal agreement and see what works for us and for the UK and what doesn't, and be realistic about what we need going forward as well.
Do you think, well, I know what you think because you said it, in relation to investment of the National Insurance Fund in the Manx economy, Laurie Hooper put forward a valiant case in relation to at least some of the National Insurance Fund being invested in the Manx economy. You were a little less certain that was a good idea.
Yeah, the concern I have there is about the concentration of risk. So if the Isle of Man economy, for any reason in the future, takes a wobble, you have something COVID or something like that, then this is people's pensions that's at risk, along with everything else that's going on. So that not only are tax receipts and NI receipts going to take a wobble, but also the investment in people's pensions would take a wobble as well. We need to be very, very careful about the income streams that we are relying on for the long-term sustainability of the National Insurance Fund and people's pensions. That's why at the moment we invest it in blue chip equities. There's a mixture of equities and bonds and other international assets that have a reasonable yield, but they're not there to get a return on investment. They're there because they're stable and they're solid and they have a diverse risk portfolio. You start to undermine that if you start to put all your eggs in one basket and you concentrate that risk here on the Isle of Man.
But perhaps one or two of the dozen eggs could be invested in the Manx economy.
Indeed, and that it wasn't a case of saying no, it's a completely bad idea altogether. But if you start putting hundreds of millions, not only could you potentially add fuel to an inflationary fire on the Isle of Man, but you always say there's that risk concentration to consider as well. So yes, of course we could put some money of that into something, but it has to be something with a revenue return in it as well. And then you're starting to have to look at commercial revenue returns. So at the moment, when we build public sector housing, which I think is what Mr. Hooper was trying to secure the money for, then the money that comes back out of that is rent. Now, at the moment, we do that on a risk-free rate of return because government borrowing is basically priced at that. If you're talking about the pension fund, then that's going to need a more commercial rate of return. So that's going to mean people paying higher rents down the line in order to prop up the NI fund. So if that's what people want, then that's fine. But that needs to be part of a slightly more detailed conversation down the line.
And the other big issue, I suppose, in that paper that was being discussed is the removal of the triple lock pension promise. Is that now inevitable?
Is it inevitable? I don't know if anything's absolutely inevitable. And if you look at the history of the last sort of 10 years or so, then the triple lock has made a big difference because we've had such a low inflation period, very benign inflationary period, and that's been unusual in the longer term history. So it's really going to depend on where we go going forward. One thing that is on everyone's minds is to make sure that pensioners have what I called a credible amount to live on. And Treasury is very much talking about the applicable amount for social security reasons. That's a completely arbitrary figure plucked from the air. I think we need something that's a bit more scientifically based. What is that credible amount for people to live on going into their old age?
That was Russian MHK Dewan Watterson. Jane Poole-Wilson was seeking support for some high-level principles on drug policy.
Phil, I agree that the principles are high-level and for good reason, because the background to this piece of work was we did initially commission Liverpool John Moores Public Health Institute, who did a fantastic report for the Isle of Man. And I think quite often governments get criticised for having a report and then not doing anything with it. So we actually debated that report a year ago, and it was really the first time Tynwald members had the opportunity to give their reflections on the report, which had taken input from people on the island, both people with lived experience, but also professionals who engage around the area of drugs, their use and the associated harms. So off the back of that initial debate, then there have been some workshops that have happened to allow some distilling, I suppose, of where people can coalesce and come together around the future direction of travel. And what we found through those workshops, which was really helpful, as well as reviewing the output from Liverpool John Moores and our own strategic needs assessments that we've had in the past, was that there is some broad areas of consensus. There are still some areas where people have quite different views on the way forward. And so those policy principles were really distilled out of all of that work and to provide the policy framework to move forward. And I think we all acknowledge this is another step along the way, but you're absolutely right. The next step then is to distill those principles, refine, if you like, well, what does that translate to in terms of how we may adapt criminal justice policy? What does it mean for education? What does it mean for public health work? What does it mean for our health services? So there is more to do, absolutely.
So in terms then of the principles, maybe if you can remember them all, or at least some of them, what are the key principles that we're talking about?
So I think the overarching aim is to reduce the harms associated with drugs, and as anybody who's listened to any of the debates or looked at any of the work in this space will recognise, the harms come in different ways. So one of the things that we definitely recognised from the feedback we had from on-island stakeholders and the research that was done was there's a growing feeling and concern around the vulnerability, if you like, and the potential risk, particularly for young people, around any use of illegal drugs and the risk of becoming involved in the criminal justice system, and then the impact of getting a criminal record on the rest of their life. And the balance sometimes between the risk of the harm caused by using certain drugs and the implications within the criminal justice system. But another harm is, of course, the use of drugs. So, for example, we had some contributors who could talk from their own lived experience about the negative impact that can have. I think there's also, in terms of criminal justice harm, there's the supply chain issue where you see, and we've seen increasingly, the involvement of serious and organised criminals. And we know that the island is a lucrative market. So listeners, I'm sure, will have seen increasing reports of the activity of the constabulary in dealing with the serious and organised criminals who are part of the supply chain of illegal drugs. But that criminality leads to other harms, including exploitation, the risk of enforcement of drug debts, violence, and so on. So there are harms in that space as well. And I think the other area is, as well as trying to not see undue harm and risk to people from acquiring a criminal record, particularly when they're very young, the other piece around it is, well, how do we support people in terms of their education, understanding, more awareness and understanding of the health impacts, and where people are seeking an alternative route, how can we better divert and support people through treatment programmes and otherwise?
Tim Glover raised the point about, I think something like a third of the prison population are there for drugs-related offences. We had Andrew Nielsen over from the Howard League for Penal Reform, and he had calculated that actually the number of, or the prison ratio per head of population on the Isle of Man is even higher than England and Wales, which is quite high for certainly for European countries. Part of what you're endeavouring to do, I'm guessing, is to try and reduce the number of people who end up in prison for drugs-related offences, but make sure that the people who are in prison are people who really should be in there for the protection of society.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, my own view, and I think it's one that a lot of members shared in the debate, is that prisons should be reserved for the most serious types of offence, but where we can address offending in a different way, particularly if it's possible to do that appropriately within the community, then we should try to do that. And we do already have a drug arrest referral scheme. What we are aware of is that even though the law doesn't change, so at the moment, the possession, the supply of drugs is illegal. But what we know from certain police forces, and I referenced Durham and Thames Valley, is that you can, within that legal framework, develop out a policy position where you try and do more around diversion, treatment and other interventions, so that you're not unduly criminalising people who perhaps may be stopped for low amounts of possession. So that, yes, we are dealing with different types of offending under the law because it will remain illegal while the law remains the same, but so that we can address those problems appropriately and sensitively. And also, I think others made the point that sometimes people who are involved in low-level supply can be in themselves also vulnerable and part of exploitation in what is an illegal trade. So I think it is about trying to find the appropriate response to different types of offences, and where we can, as I've said, divert and support different outcomes for people at the lower level of the spectrum of offending.
One of the perhaps more fanciful elements of the report, and apologies for putting it that way, but this was that in some way we would persuade people that taking drugs wasn't a good idea. I'm guessing that people have been trying to persuade people that taking drugs isn't a good idea for a while, and that's not really been particularly successful.
Well, there were contributions in the debate that acknowledged that there is recreational use of drugs, and in fact, in the feedback we had and the research from Liverpool John Moores, there was a recognition in terms of which drugs do people perceive to be most harmful on the Isle of Man. Alcohol and tobacco were up there, and we know they're legalised drugs. So I think there is a recognition, and I do think we have to acknowledge the society we live in. And I think there was another helpful contribution that also recognised there are different views in society about the different harms associated with different drugs. So one of the other things I think is really important is that we try and be evidence-led with this. We recognise the data perhaps isn't all it could or should be in the Isle of Man in terms of us having a really good understanding of the harms in our society. So one of the other principles was actually to try and make sure we build and do better around that data, partly so we can track the harms, but also it's important to know if you make changes in policy and changes in practice, is it having the desired effect? Is it doing what you hoped it would do? And I think that's really important. But also moving forward, I think it helps society understand better. So what are the different harms and what are the different things we can do to help people understand the harms and make informed choices?
It could be argued that the war on drugs has not succeeded. In fact, if anything, it would appear that the use of drugs is becoming a more acceptable thing perhaps than it was maybe 10, 20 years ago. Has the department not thought that maybe actually we should be looking at a greater amount of freedom in relation to drugs, so perhaps legalising some of the what are deemed to be the lower impact drugs?
So I think one of the things that's quite interesting is when you look at the data in terms of what data we do have around use, it hasn't necessarily massively fluctuated over time. But I think your point about are people's attitudes different, I think there is a recognition that people's attitudes change, and it's not wholly generational, I think, but I think, most of us who have young children, and people will talk about their grandchildren as well, recognise that there is more prevalence and more acceptance, I suppose, among our younger generation. But I think, we have always recognised that the Isle of Man's work in this area also has to recognise its the fact that it's a signatory to certain UN conventions via the UK. So in terms of our legal parameters, we have to be cognisant and aware of those. And I think the other thing that we recognised in the report was we did acknowledge that there is that issue for future consideration about what does the longer term future look like in terms of how people can be protected, recognising that we probably do have to acknowledge there is an ongoing level of use of drugs. So what is the appropriate way forward, and the evidence that exists around how we regulate legal drugs and how we can help with harms both around legal and illegal drugs.
So obviously we've got slightly more than a year and a half left of this administration. What do you expect to have achieved now that the principles have been agreed over the course of the next 18 months to 2 years?
So I'm very aware that it's not just a Home Affairs issue, and I made that very clear because of the complexities and the different areas that are affected. But we have our community safety partnership in place, and a number of relevant different bodies sit on that. So what I would expect now is that we can start to translate the principles that we've agreed into some practicalities. For example, with the criminal justice approach, how can we develop our existing drug referral schemes to be more effective, to get the outcomes we want, which is to try and divert people and avoid unduly criminalising people. I'm looking forward to working, though, with public health to understand how their work around improving population health overall can feed into this. There was reference to the importance of education, and I think that's education within our schools, but I think that's wider societal education. So again, I think how do you translate that into something meaningful and pragmatic that helps the population understand more about these issues and make better choices, make more informed choices.
On to another item then on the order paper, and that was in relation to the, I can't remember the full title, the Constitutional Legal Affairs and Justice Committee, and they had a fairly modest little recommendation in one of their reports to introduce a legally qualified chair to the Industrial Tribunal Committee. Council of Ministers wasn't satisfied with that and wanted to go much further.
Well, I think the committee is really, really helpful report, and I think it's understood, and the contribution from Mrs. Kinnish on Legislative Council, I think, illustrated this well, that the tribunal system was set up to be a sort of informal way of accessing justice, but the reality is, and particularly when it comes to equality and employment law, the law is quite complicated now. And so I think the committee, with evidence from the island's judiciary, but also from the Richard Wright KC report, was bringing forward the idea that we would be served better having a permanent judicial officer with the expertise and knowledge to sit when we see volume, but also increasing complexity, particularly around the legal matters. I think Council of Ministers' perspective was, well, actually, there's probably a wider opportunity to drive reform because we have about 22 tribunals at the moment. I think 21 of those all have their own separate sets of rules. We know some of them do sit fairly frequently, and the Employment and Equality Tribunal is a good example. Some of them sit infrequently, if at all. And yet what we try to do is appoint to all of them not only chairs, but lay members in many cases. And I think it's really difficult, actually, to, one, keep attracting people, but two, enable people to keep their skills and their ability to sit on matters when they do arise as up to date and refreshed as possible. So I think Council of Ministers saw an opportunity to try and serve our tribunals better, both their operation, but also the members who do sit on them as chairs and lay members. And I think there's also an opportunity to do some now rationalising of these different sets of procedures and rules, and a single judicial lead that would predominantly lead on the Employment and Equality Tribunal, I think, but could also lead for other tribunals, look at the system, help with reviewing and updating procedures across the piece, streamlining to the extent it's appropriate. There will always be a need for some specialist detail, but also then managing and coordinating the whole of the tribunal service and supporting panels of chairs and lay members to be allocated appropriately. We could see merit in terms of efficiencies, effectiveness and so on in driving a wider reform.
Cynics, of course, might say that in recent years government's had its fingers burned by various tribunal reports, and this is just a case of government trying to come back and maybe clip the wings of some of these tribunals. I'm guessing you'll say that the cynics are wrong.
I'll go much further than that. I would absolutely refute that anything like that is happening here. It is really important to recognise that a judicial lead would be still an officer of the courts, the judiciary, entirely separate from government. It is absolutely vital that we recognise that, even our permanent judiciary that sit in the High Court and so on, they are permanent judicial officers. But as the minister who speaks for Council of Ministers on Justice Matters, I would strongly defend maintenance of their full independence and separation from the executive, and that would have to absolutely remain the case as far as the tribunal service is concerned.
And finally, it's fair to say that we were all expecting at some point in the course of this week to hear a new lineup in Council of Ministers. I mean, you're the Deputy Chief Minister. Is Council of Ministers not a particularly popular place for people to be?
Oh, well, I'm not sure I would go that far, Phil. I know the Chief Minister has been taking the time to talk to all Tynwald colleagues, which I think is vitally important, because I think, people, I hope, do want to contribute, because in the end, the work that we're doing is in the interest of the island. It's for the people we represent. And I think the ability to take part, the wish to take part is important. So I think to allow him to continue to have those proper conversations with people is really important.
Deputy Chief Minister Jane Poole-Wilson, MHK. And finally, John Wannenberg. You had an urgent question down about the RNLI. What was the reason behind that?
Well, I wanted to get a snapshot of where we are with the RNLI. Obviously, this is a big year for the RNLI. It's 200th anniversary, and I'm keen to understand where we are with terms of the old boathouse, etc.
What seems to be happening is there is a consideration being based on actual need, and we have lifeboat stations at other parts of the island. And I'm guessing, is the RNLI thinking, well, do we actually still need this particular lifeboat station? How would you respond if that is the kind of consideration the RNLI is having at the moment?
Well, I would fully expect them to have that consultation and evaluate where their needs are and address them appropriately. They are a charity after all, and they must spend their money wherever it's going to have the most effect. On the other hand, I, as a politician, I'm keen to understand if the steam packet, for example, has an accident off Marine Drive, what happens then? Who's going to come and help us then? And if Orsted goes ahead in the years to come in the wind farm, that's more dangerous for an accident than what we have now. So we've got to think of the future, and I think the RNLI has always had a huge part to play on the Isle of Man. And just because the boathouse is going to be downgraded, or looking that way, I'm keen to make sure that they get every assistance they have, or they can get from the Isle of Man government.
And do you think that, based on what the DOI Minister was saying, that Isle of Man government is providing every assistance it can?
Well, that was the exact question, and he gave the answer in the affirmative, so I take him at his word. But we are all accountable here.
And as far as the old, the lifeboat station as is, we also heard from the Minister that is going to be demolished because it's no longer fit for purpose. How do you react to that?
How do I react to an old building being knocked down because it's not fit for purpose? I celebrate that, Phil.
That was Douglas North MHK John Wannenberg. So what do you think? Are you pleased that the Chief Minister is putting so much of his time and energy into tackling the Manx care overspend? Do you share Laurie Hooper's surprise that no new public sector housing has been built? Should we be taking the risk of investing some of our National Insurance Fund in the Manx economy? Are you surprised that none of the backbench MHKs seem willing to take up Alf Cannon's offer to join the Council of Ministers team that is working so hard to fix the problems we're all facing? Is the very modest ministerial salary enhancement putting MHKs off, particularly with an election looming in just over 18 months' time? I'm Phil Gaughan, Guramaeus and Geistachrum. Thanks for listening.